Hello and welcome to Project Noon, a platform dedicated to critically and creatively exploring Hindu-Muslim dialogue. My guest today is Professor Chakravarthi Ram-Prasad. Professor Ram-Prasad is a fellow of the British Academy and distinguished professor of comparative philosophy and religion, Lancaster University, UK. He's the author of numerous works, including Knowledge and Liberation in Classical Indian Thought, Advaita Epistemology and Metaphysics, an outline of Indian non-realism, Eastern philosophy, India, life, myth and art, Indian philosophy and the consequences of knowledge, the 2013 publication, Divine Self, Human Self, which is the topic of today's discussion, as well as more recently, Human Being, Bodily Being, Phenomenology from Classical India. Professor Ram-Prasad, firstly, thank you for your generous time and for joining us today.
Thank you.
So, the central motif which I want to pick up from this book of yours today is how do these two prominent thinkers, Shankara and Ramanuja, how do they conceptualize Brahman differently in their understanding of and in their commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita? And secondarily, what is the conceptualization of God? So this is the broad question which I want to tease today. But before we go there, Professor, can you give us a brief background of the text of the Gita itself and its relation in the larger corpus of the Vedanta, the Upanishads, the Brahma Sutras? Where does it stand and where do these commentaries stand in that connection?
Right. Okay, so looking at it historically, so the Bhagavad Gita is one element within probably the longest pre-modern composition in the world, the Mahabharata, which is a complex multi-generational narrative about the struggle for power between two sets of cousins.
Right.
But the Mahabharata also contains not only the narrative, but many long dialogues between various figures exploring the nature of reality, the nature of truth, of God, of human beings, and so forth, which is why the sort of the ancient Indian attitude was that everything that can be found in the world is found in the Mahabharata. In light of that, the Gita is one more of those dialogues. And in fact, the two characters in it, Sri Krishna and Arjuna, themselves have other dialogues. And Arjuna speaks with others and Krishna speaks with others through the Mahabharata. So in that way, the Gita is deeply embedded in this dialogical style by which the Mahabharata explores fundamental questions. However, in the centuries after its composition, the Bhagavad Gita, or the Song of the Lord, took on increasingly a special place of its own accord. Now, within the Mahabharata, it occurs as the dialogue between this warrior, Arjuna, and his charioteer, Krishna. Arjuna looks across the battlefield, and on the other side, he sees not just the cousins with whom he is wrestling for power, but also his elders, his uncle, his great uncles, his teachers, and so forth. Now, they feel compelled to fight against Arjuna and his brothers because they are bound by loyalty to the current king, who is the uncle of Arjuna. Arjuna is also at this point representing not just himself as a warrior, but his elder brother who has this claim to the throne. And he's also keenly mindful of the great humiliation visited on his wife Draupadi. And he is also the leader of the greatest warrior on the side of his brothers, the Pandavas. So there are multiple reasons why it has come to this point of conflict. And yet, seeing these people who he greatly trusts and respects unwillingly fighting against him, and knowing that great sort of death and destruction is going to come from this war, Arjuna throws down his weapon and says he would rather not fight. He would rather not bear the responsibility for being the warrior that he has so far been. He would rather sacrifice all his honor, all his valor, all his dignity, and renounce action and go away into the forest and no longer engage with the world, which has brought him to what he clearly perceives is going to be a tragic outcome. He is counseled by his cousin and non-combatant charioteer, Krishna, who says, actually, the way to understand himself, Arjuna, and the way to understand the world will in fact lead to action. And Krishna primarily says two things. One, that metaphysically, ultimately, that the play of the world, of the actors in it, the individual warrior, Arjuna, and all the others, are simply not the ultimate truth. The ultimate truth is that of a self, the Atman, which is eternal and undying and which goes through cycles of life until it gains liberation from that cycle. Therefore, the most important thing to do is to think about this metaphysics of the cycle of lives rather than be caught up and entangled in this particular life and this particular identity. Within this particular life and particular identity, Krishna gives the second aspect of his reasoning, which is that as a warrior, as a brother, as a husband, as a leader, Arjuna has certain duties that he must perform. So in the entanglement of this life, as this particular person, Prince Arjuna, he should perform his duties, he should adhere to those duties. And those duties require him to fight. Now, how do those two things come together? He says, you understand the reflex in you to renounce, to walk away from this, because you are thinking about the ultimate nature of reality. But what I'm telling you is that the combination of understanding the ultimate nature of yourself, this Atman, and your role as a warrior and your duties as a warrior actually are not pulling away from against each other. They work together. How? Act according to your duty, your dharma, your role in life, but act without wanting the fruit of that action. So the actual performance of your warrior duties is not to fight for glory and for power and for wealth, but to fight because it is right at this point to defend a particular moral view. What consequences happen, whether you win or you lose, great fame comes to you or you just die in battle, whatever, forsake those consequences. Why? Because only by forsaking those consequences will your ultimate, your essential self gain freedom. So, in fact, and knowing that you're ultimately not this bodily warrior, but this self. Knowing that you're a warrior now and that you must act, hold these two things together by acting while sacrificing or renouncing the fruit of your action. So the real renunciation is not running away from the battle which you must fight as a warrior, but to renounce the fruit that will come out of the glory and valor of your actions. Arjuna gets this. Arjuna understands the structure of it, but he cannot bring his own heart to bear on this intellectual understanding that he must act while renouncing the fruits, that he must act knowing the difference between the person he is in this life and the eternal self. And that, in order to bring those two together and make his heart be engaged in this, Krishna says, I am telling you this, not in effect as an intellectual exercise, not even as a moral exhortation. I tell you because I am the God who runs the universe, the cosmos as it is. And in the peroration of these 18 chapters of the Mahabharata, in the 11th chapter, he reveals himself as the divine. And he says, it's from the view of the divine, I see the difference. I know the difference between this world and the ultimate. I know the workings of action and its consequences. All of those things of time and space are already bound up within me. It is that which takes Arjuna into the place where the knowledge he has been given by Krishna is able to motivate him with faith into action. So this combination proved compelling, proved important in the centuries thereafter, after the Mahabharata was redacted in its form. And in the 8th century, the philosopher Shankara, the thinker, took the Gita to be conveying something special, which was consistent with the message of what had always been seen in the Hindu traditions as of ultimate sacred value, the Upanishads, which were much older than the Gita, which were also dialogical and also spoke of the nature of the self and its relation to ultimate reality. Shankara said, within this narrative of the Gita, the same message is conveyed. So what Krishna is really teaching is about the relationship between the ultimate self, the Atman, and all of reality, the absolute, which is Brahman, that which bears up everything. And for Shankara, Krishna is the self-realized. Krishna is the one who has knowledge of the nature of the self, the nature of reality, the nature of the absolute. And how to explain that Krishna is presented and self-presents as Bhagavan, the Lord, Ishvara, God. Shankara says, well, how we should understand God is that God is the concrete realization of ultimate reality. So Krishna is the manifestation of the ultimate relationship between the innermost self and the ultimate reality. So Shankara was primarily interested in explaining how the deepest message of the Gita is consistent with the more ancient message of the Upanishads, which is that all is contained in this absolute, this ultimate, which is Brahman. And this consciousness in us, the self-awareness, which is the essential self, the Atman, is not different from it. And in that picture, Advaita, as it is called, non-duality, there is no duality, everything is this ultimate reality. The personal God, Krishna, who speaks this and says, I am God. How to explain that? Well, Shankara says, how do we understand God? His reading of God is that God is the mediating presence, is the self-realized presence, by which those of us, the ordinary human beings, who think of ourselves as separate, who are trapped in our own limited consciousness, who are as battered by the ups and downs of life as Arjuna was, we can be released from our limitations through the self-realized, the consciousness that is aware of its own universality, i.e. Krishna, that is God.
Right.
So what Shankara does is he takes the teachings in the Gita which talk about this ultimate reality and says that is the important part of the Gita. And the presence of Krishna, this apparent human being who turns out, who reveals himself as divine, is a method, a means through which any of us can realize that we are one or not different from the ultimate consciousness that is Brahman.
Well, right. Shankara's hermeneutic in his Gita commentary, where you say that unlike his commentary on the Brahma Sutras, for example, he finds a particular challenge in the Gita commentary because he has to deal with the personal theistic message of the Gita and the devotional worship and the pietistic worship which it discusses. So how does he engage with this dimension of the text?
Yes, so as I was explaining, so what he has to do that he does not have to do with the Upanishads,
right,
or the Brahma Sutras. And the Brahma Sutras are just really summaries of the Upanishadic teaching.
Right.
So in that sense, they are consistent. Whatever we can read of the Upanishads, we are going to be able to read in the Brahma Sutra. And although later theistic commentaries, and we'll come to that, of course, with Ramanuja, although they will then wonder how, they will see theistic elements in some of the Upanishads more than the older Upanishads. For Shankara, the older Upanishads, the Brihadaranyaka, the Chandogya, these are consistent with how he reads the Brahma Sutra, which is at all times mapping the consciousness that seems separate, limited, bodied, how to map that into the ground reality, which is consciousness, universal consciousness, how to do it. So for Shankara, this is the task of the Advaitin. Here is the view which is given by these sacred texts, which is that Atman, the innermost consciousness of us, is not different from Brahman, which is the universal consciousness, the reality of which the world is a manifestation. But Obviously, this consciousness, that is the expression of the Atman, the self, seems limited, seems stuck in its own ignorance. It does not realize anything in ordinary experience like that universality, that dissolution of individuality. Its normal experience is to feel absolutely individual. The consciousness here does not have access, except through ordinary communication, with the consciousness there. How is this to be explained? What are we to do about it? So Shankara says there are processes of self-realization by which this individuality can be overcome. There can be a de-individualization of consciousness, so that what seems limited in this particular locus actually becomes no different from the universal consciousness that is Brahman, that encompasses all reality. So the relationship between the material and the conscious, the limited and the universal, the many and the one, all of these can be seen, can be explained as not ultimate. That's Shankara's challenge. Now, because there is enough in the Upanishads, especially the older Upanishads and in the Brahma Sutras, about this relationship between Atman and Brahman, Shankara's task in some ways seems more straightforward than with the Gita, because in the Gita, what is Krishna doing? What are we going to do with Krishna? And what Krishna is saying is, I am the Lord. So he does use the language, the Gita does use the language of Atman and Brahman. Krishna teaches about Brahman, but ultimately he also sort of reveals himself as the divine, as the God that encompasses all very clearly. No way around it. So what is Shankara going to do? So Shankara says, well, what we should do is radically, we should understand by Krishna, by the divine, we should understand something very unlike what the normal worshipper in a temple or at an altar might think. The people who go through the processes of worship and prayer, what they think they are doing and who they think they are praying to, we must really fundamentally revise. We must revise our conception of the divine as much as we must revise our conception of who our self is. Just as our ordinary sense of self turns out to be really fundamentally mistaken, because it's not individuated, it's not limited, it is in fact not different from reality, the same way we should also revise our conception of the God of the Bhagavad Gita. What is that God then? Well, that God is simply consciousness revealing its non-duality. So Krishna is a figure in which consciousness is already non-dual. So unlike us, Krishna is the entity who looks limited, and even in the cosmic revelation is still a particular kind of limitation. But that consciousness is indicating to Arjuna, and therefore all of us, that in fact non-duality is the truth. That in fact the consciousness that seems limited can become dissolved into and attain the universal consciousness. Krishna, therefore, as God, and therefore God itself, should be understood as a kind of mediating state through which the non-duality between self and reality, Atman and Brahman, can be realized. So in a way, what Shankara has to do is he has to subordinate what today we would call theology, an accounting of theos, of God, within this, what I've called a trans metaphysics, what is even beyond being, all of being, the ground of being, Brahman. God is part of it. So God is how we try and understand through language, through devotion, through acts of worship, what it is to become non-dual in consciousness. What we see with Shankara, therefore, is this radical, from a point of view of a Hindu devotee or of a theologian in any theistic tradition, what Shankara is proposing is something quite radical, which is he wants to look at any theistic account, but the Gita, of course, is the most powerful and by his time already a very authoritative account of divine self-presence as a means of the individual self attaining a realization that it is not different from the ultimate ground of all things. So, to put it in somewhat simplistic terms, for Shankara, the account of the nature, the structures of reality, what we would call metaphysics, the nature of knowledge, what we would now call epistemology, the nature of the way our states of consciousness work, what we now call philosophy of mind, and the nature of the divine as theology are all in the end subsumed under what I'm calling trans metaphysics, which is what is the ground of all being. So for him, the being of the world, the being of God, the being of the self, the being of knowledge, all of that has a ground in Brahman. So Brahman itself comes from a word which means to bear. So all of being is born in Brahman. So from that perspective, for Shankara, every theology is penultimate, not ultimate. It is before what we stop with, what we cannot go beyond, and that is Brahman. Whereas the divine is, for Shankara, the way in which human consciousness understands its capacity for self-transcendence. So Krishna is the manifestation of that self-transcendence of the limited consciousness. But what Krishna's self-transcendence means is consciousness of Brahman. So that is how, for Shankara, theology, very crudely put, is subsumed along with metaphysics, along with all other branches of self-discovery and self-knowledge, in this ground that is Brahman. Subsequently, as it happens, people working on Advaita have to then try and revive the more devotional life from out of it. And that's why, for example, I was suggesting, I would suggest Anant Rambachan's book, The Advaitic Worldview, which tries to make this very rigorous, very austere journey of self-recognition as somehow compatible with a religious life. For Shankara, the religious life is only a means to realization.
Right.
In fact, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Right. Sorry. I mean, there's one sentence in the book which, before we go ahead, if you could just elaborate on that. You say about Shankara uses this term akhyam, so-called, when referring to I suppose, a theistic picture of Brahman. But you write about it that this points to the limitation of God as that of which we can speak. So
yes, exactly. So
can you elaborate this statement?
Yes.
Please?
So for Ramanuja, for Shankara, Brahman as ultimate is what is no longer contained by the language and understanding of human beings. The God that is Krishna as God, and God therefore, is itself conceivable, is within the range, the compass of our conscious grasp. So for Shankara, God is on the side of human reach through language, through worship, through sacred text. Whereas Brahman is as it were, beyond the limit of our understanding. We know Brahman is simply the name given for the transcendence of consciousness. So even the use of the word Brahman is still within our language, but we are able, consciousness is able to dissolve its limitations. That is, it is an act of faith, but it's an act of faith in reality. And it's an act of faith in God, that is Krishna, to undertake to live a life according to what Krishna teaches in the Gita. Do it, but it's not, in a way you become like Krishna, don't actually become that. But it's a teaching about how to transcend, and God is still within our reach. Krishna, our conception, that is of God, is within the reach of human consciousness. Brahman, because it is by definition what is absolute, what is not limited, what is not in language, what is not accessible through reasoning, is something that is beyond.
Right. So right. In contrast to this, how does Ramanuja look at?
We have Ramanuja.
Conceptualized Brahman, right?
Exactly. And Ramanuja has a view which has been seen, I think, in some theistic traditions as well, which is how to push to these limits and simultaneously speak of God, a God of love and rightness, the God by whom we live, the God whom we worship. How to have God within reach, but yet at the same time acknowledge that it is God who is beyond the limitations of human understanding. In Krishna of the Bhagavad Gita, Ramanuja sees that God. Now, as I was saying, the Bhagavad Gita does talk about this Brahman-Atman relationship. because clearly, in a historical sense, the Gita is using and echoing the Upanishadic teachings. But for Ramanuja, of course, the challenge is the other way around, because how do you take this relationship between Brahman and Atman, the non-difference? How do you subsume it within a theistic worldview? What he does is, that's why he embarks on what he calls a Visistadvaita, a qualified non-duality as a way of describing his position. What is the non-duality? The non-duality is, yes, Brahman and Atman are ultimately not different. You can't get around this. The Gita says it, the Upanishads say it. As a Vedantin, Ramanuja is committed to seeing that view in the Brahma Sutras. But what does Krishna say? Krishna says in the Gita about his being Brahman and the Atman being Brahman. So Ramanuja says there is a relationship of oneness between Atman and Brahman, which is the oneness between all orders of being, including us and God. So the Brahman-Atman relationship is the encompassing of reality by God. So Krishna is Brahman. Brahman and Atman are non-dual. Therefore, there is some sense in which we are contained in God. We are not separate from God. There is a oneness to our consciousness with God. Other commentators on the Gita later, especially the Advaita school, will completely reject that. They will say there has to be a complete duality, Dvaita. There can be no contamination of the divine by the individual self. And in a way that sort of echoes discussions in Islam and to some extent in Christianity. There is this notion, if you are saying that there is a profound containment of ourself, within God, is that somehow a limitation or contamination of God or not? So one tendency is to say, no, there should be no connection. There should be an utter distinction. And later commentators like Madhva of the Advaita school say that. Ramanuja plays this, he has a combination. He says we have to understand the relationship between Krishna and us in two ways. One is this duality, this non-duality, which is the Atman Brahman that Krishna talks about, which is the Upanishadic language. It is a way of saying that the individual self is contained in Brahman, and Brahman is the being of God. So if God is all-encompassing, if Brahman is all being and God is Brahman, then the world and individual selves are all part of Brahman. And therefore, we are all contained in the being of God. So Ramanuja interprets Brahman not as the ground of being as Shankara does, not as that from which everything else comes, by which everything is born, including God. Rather, for him, Brahman is being. It is ultimate being. Ultimate in the sense it contains all orders. So the world and selves, souls are all part of this Brahman. And therefore, to that extent, God, who is ultimate being, contains all of that. But that is only one part. There is a massive qualification now to come. That is okay. If Krishna is Brahman, is at the end of the story. For Ramanuja, no. Krishna being Brahman is only an aspect of Krishna. So this entire metaphysics of non-duality, of Atman and Brahman, which he grants, is to be qualified now by saying Krishna is beyond Brahman. It's beyond being. Krishna cannot be contained by metaphysics. Metaphysics is what our capacity for knowledge can grasp. And to that extent, of course, we must grasp that we are not limited. We are not atomistic. We are not completely separate. We are part of this one consciousness that is God. So the relationship we have with one another is potentially a radical one, because we are not monads, we are not kept apart. We are ultimately contained in God. But God is not contained in us. So Atman and Brahman are not different. But Krishna is more than Brahman. So he interprets the Gita to be saying that I contain Brahman. My relationship with Brahman is I am Brahman, but I'm also, in me is Brahman. So what is me that is not Brahman? It is what in modern language, theologians in the West have called God beyond being. Because the idea is that being is always within the reach of human understanding. Being is the subject of metaphysics. But God is not just being. It's not that, of course, there is a sense in which God is. Therefore, we must say that being, God encompasses being. But God is not exhausted by it. God is beyond being. That, for Ramanuja, is what Krishna is teaching in his revelation. Saying everything, when all your language, all your capacity has been exhausted, there is God beyond that. Now, does that leave us with bafflement? What do we do with a God who outruns everything we can ever bring into the realm of our consciousness? Even if we are not different from God, there is God beyond. What do we do? There, Ramanuja brings his theological vision to explain what Krishna is doing. It is out of love and out of grace, God becomes accessible. So this is Ramanuja's larger theology, which is brought to bear on the Gita commentary too. Says the paradox of God is impossible to reach, and yet easy to reach. There is the majesty which puts us beyond, God beyond us, and yet God also, out of love and grace, becomes available, becomes dear. Krishna is Arjuna's friend, his cousin, his charioteer. He serves Arjuna. God is that intimate. God is present in an easy way, daily way, in each prayer, in each word, each promise that Krishna gives. God is saying, I'm there. So what we have to do is simultaneously understand that God is beyond everything that our understanding can possibly encompass. And yet, instead of being left as this baffling, tremendous mystery, God chooses to become wholly available in every fiber of ordinary life, like Krishna was with Arjuna. So that is how Ramanuja takes exactly Shankara's worldview and flips it around. So for Shankara, the theology of Krishna is encompassed in the search for the self-knowledge of Brahman. For Ramanuja, the self-knowledge of Brahman is simply one aspect of this utter surrender to the grace and love of a God who becomes accessible. And I think it is arguable that to say that sort of God of love that Ramanuja sees in the Gita is much more the Hindu devotional attitude to Krishna. On the whole, in day-to-day life, the Krishna who is beloved of Hindus, of whom is in a sense theologically whatever the technicalities, theologically on the whole, what Ramanuja was seeing in the Gita. But at the same time, this dialectic between these two ways of looking at the Gita inaugurated subsequent centuries of other commentaries, of other perspectives. And it always comes down to this question: how do you work through to the limits of our understanding about what reality is? And how do you locate that working through of our understanding of reality with the understanding of God? Are you going to see God as, in some sense, assumable into the working through of our understanding of reality? Or are you going to say that God is the source of this understanding? Or are you going to say God is beyond any working through of reality? All these different kinds of positions, each has its own challenges, its own comfort, its own way of appealing to how people are oriented. That's why they continue to exist. And these kinds of things happen in other traditions, perhaps between traditions which you can have religious traditions which are atheistic, like in Buddhism. So I think humanity is constantly circling around. Do we have an ultimate explanation? How is that related to our working through of reality? And what is the nature? Where are we to locate the human reflex to worship, to surrender, to love? Are you going to say they are simply part of how human beings are and we need to work past them? Or do we say, no, they represent something far more profound than anything our explanations can ever provide? Those are the two. And the fact that the Gita provides the material to be read in these two dramatically opposed ways, makes it a text that becomes sort of indicative of the capacity for human beings to think in very different ways. So when we make interfaith comparisons, when we make comparative theological work, we should always be careful. Who exactly are we comparing? What exactly is our interpretation? So my tendency always is to say that when we are thinking theologically, it is not enough to say Hindu-Christian or Hindu-Muslim comparisons. What we have to do is to take individual views and familiarize ourselves in the most sympathetic sensitive, committed ways. I mean, that's why I suggested Frank Looney's work. Because what Frank does is he's saying, what is the point of my understanding Vedanta Deshika, this great Sri Vaishnava thinker, successor of Ramanuja? What is the point if all I'm going to do is, oh, this is a Sanskrit text, this is the grammar, these are the ideas in a mechanical, scholarly way? It is to be open to the possibility of a divine intervention in my life, although I am a Jesuit who was trained in a particular way. That's what Frank is saying. And I think that that idea that you are clear of your place of existence and yet are open to where the mystery of the divine might come from, that is very dependent on who you're working with and what you are thinking through. So you shouldn't, my tendency has always been to say, when we are doing this, interfaith work, we shouldn't think, oh, look at this person working on these two particular individuals. I want to talk about, the traditions. That's not the right way to go about it. For each of us, it is working through. It's no less important. In fact, it is the only possible way to focus on the specifics of what you know and what you study. And each of us, therefore, in a way like a fractal, each person's interfaith engagement is part of a larger way of encompassing the differences of humanity.
There is, of course, as you so eloquently mentioned, this has been a perennial dilemma or a challenge for humanity to, or the various human traditions of how do you relate God and being, God and reality, or how you perceive reality. In this context, you have some interesting discussion on Heideggerian ontotheology and how, where you situate Ramanuja within that, or in the context of that conversation.
Yes.
If we can, maybe close with that final comment, right?
Sure. Yeah. So I am convinced that that in the Western context, Heidegger's critique of ontotheology is right. And I think that in my book, what I'm arguing is that is why Ramanuja himself never engaged with what other Hindu traditions have done in their debates with others, both Hindu and Buddhist, about whether God exists or not. And Ramanuja saying this is not a question about existence is very similar in a way to the Heideggerian critique of ontotheology. So if you take ontotheology, therefore, to be the undertaking to determine the being of God. So ontology is about the furniture of reality, and ontotheology is how God is part of that reality. And I think that in that way, I mean, sometimes, I very cruelly kind of talk about this as saying, God is not like a spoon or a star, to say, what is God's existence? And it doesn't matter how many superlatives you pile on God of omnipotence and omnipresence and, omniscience. They are still simply qualifications of what we grasp. We take knowledge, we take power, right? We take presence, and we say all of it. And that's God. It's still simply working within the compass of our conception of being. So God is always then brought into and contained by the reach of human thinking. And while I agree, of course, that there is tremendous emotional resonance and comfort in thinking of God as supreme being, saying the supremacy of God is what people focus on when they worship, when they pray, when they take an orientation in life, they're thinking about the supremacy. But what the critique of ontotheology is doing is to point out supremacy comforts, but so long as you're thinking of God as the supreme being, you're still keeping God within the reassurance of the grasp of being. Being is something that we know because we are beings. We exist. And so we are always keeping God simply as being, and then we add all these superlatives to say supreme being. So the comfort is there, but when you push, you come to the fact that God is still within the reach of complete human understanding. And I think what Ramanuja is saying here is, in that sense, 1,000 years before, what the Heideggerian criticism of ontotheology did in Western theology, for some people at least. And I think there's a whole other question of why this is a very appealing view, but is never articulated in that way in Islam, because I think there are resources in Islam which are always limiting ontotheological readings, but that's another story which I can't go into now. I think that I think what Ramanuja is doing is, while acknowledging through the metaphysics of Atman Brahman, he's acknowledging that there is some way in which there is an epistemological reassurance to thinking of God as supreme being, the being who encompasses all being, the being of all beings. Whatever that assent is, okay, that's also there. Let's not deny that. But truly, the God who is worth loving, the God who is worth surrendering to, is a God who is simultaneously inexplicable, completely mysterious, because beyond being. And yet at the same time, worthy of love and surrender, precisely because in grace, in mercy, becomes available in all these familiar ways, in daily prayer, in all those qualities and all the narratives and all the other ways in which humans live their religious life. Otherwise, the removal of God from our being will then kill off. If you're going to just turn around and say, as some atheists have done, to say, well, if God is supreme being, we can demolish, the metaphysics of this, and then you're left with religion as an illusion, right? So what Ramanuja is doing is to say, that's not what you should base the love of God on, the trust in God on, the faith in God on. That should be on the God who escapes being, who's beyond thing, and yet becomes available in all those ways. And I think that is something that is, although radically different in how different traditions see God as becoming available, whether it's in Christianity or in Islam or in Sikhism, this move of saying at one and the same time, God is not contained by the critique of ontotheology, and yet God is worthy of love because God becomes mercifully available to us. That move, I think, is something that perhaps is found in all these traditions across time and space.
Right. And of course, it is a revelatory ontotheology. God reveals himself out of his grace to be available.
That's right. Yes, you cannot have faith without revelation. If faith is simply built on reasoning, as analytic philosophers of religion do, they will always be open to the ontotheological critique. The point about faith is, if faith is built on proof, then it's not faith. And proof is within the compass of reasoning, and therefore is part of an ontotheology. So the only way in which that faith in the love of God and the mercy of God is possible is through revelation. And it is coexisting with the revelatory orientation of our fellow human beings, instead of using that as a means to persecute and exclude and overcome. That is the greatest challenge for us. And that's not an intellectual exercise. It is simply saying, this revelation there's no reason to it, right? That's the point. Revelation is simply the bursting forth of love and mercy. Who are you to judge how God becomes available? For you, completely in one zone tradition, that's how you live. No question about that. You don't turn around and say, I'm going to give up the specificity of my life and my faith commitment. My call to faith is my call to faith. There's no question about that. Otherwise, it wouldn't be living according to a revelation, right? What I would say is that the significance of this God beyond being is that for interfaith understanding is that the God beyond being is the most compelling way to think of the oneness of God. And the oneness of God is at the heart of the oneness of humanity. How we interpret it is the constant task of our dialogue and our engagement. But a commitment to that God beyond being allows us to live according to the revelatory faith that I've mentioned and we've been discussing, while at the same time being open to the humanity of others who have their own relationship to that one God. So that's, for me, through Ramanuja, I arrive at how love and faith are one and the same, both in relationship between the human and the divine, and the relationship between humans who believe differently in the divine. Thank you.
Right. Right. Well, I think that's a good place to bring this to a close. Professor, again, thank you for your generous time and for the brilliant conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.